Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. It's sort of a different movie, even for its director, because I think most of the time when you have a film like this, you'd have a director who was kind of made the artistic decision to make a different film from their own style, which most of Ryan Coogler's films, aside from this, are mainly about like masculinity and dealing with that either in the modern age or through these legacies with both Creed and Black Panther. This is noticeably not that at all because of the death of Chadwick Boseman. But I don't know, it's weird because it is not the Coogler necessarily, I think. He's the guy who makes these like big blockbuster home run movies, and he's very good at it. And I do think this movie works and is good, and I found it very compelling. While I was watching it, I was very much like into this movie the whole time I was watching it. But it is just very different vibe-wise. And I think a lot of that is because he was 100% out of his comfort zone, had to honor the lead of the previous film, and kind of like in a role that had, sort of titanic, seismic reverberations in the culture that you can't really just ignore. I think it's shocking that this movie works as well as it does, and I think when you see reviews, I think almost people want to applaud him for like, hey, this is watchable, and that's an astonishment in itself. This sort of works. Oh my god. For the most part, and I don't think this movie's perfect, and I do think it's a little saggier and shabbier than we expect from him. I do think it really works. But I think this is probably, I think there's sometimes audiences and critics will give a director a pass, but I honestly think with this one it's just more like wow, you did this, oh my god. Like that's astonishing. And I think that's like it's kind of also throughout this film where you feel like they're a little like, how do we do this in the Marvel machine, how are we forced to do this in the Marvel machine, that sort of stuff. I think it all culminates in a way. At the end of it, I don't know if they know where this franchise goes or this property within the whole universe of the MCU and everything. But I do think he was able to make the film he made. I'm wondering if he'll continue to make these films, Black Panther movies, after this one. But the main way this works is by the female leads, which I think they really worked out having such a strong supporting cast with Lupita Nyong'o, Latia Wright, Angela Bassett especially, Donal Guerrera. It's just a really great supporting cast, and I think without that, they probably would have said forget it. Let's not even bother. And they did do an amazing job because of that, and I think some of the material, like the weaknesses in it, didn't come out as much, and that's something that Marvel movies have been doing since the beginning, where you get good enough actors to like sell this material, and that is 100% what they did, because it's also like a very female-centric film, and not in a way that like I think most of the time when you do that now, you call that out sort of in the film. It's like a part of the movie, it's like mentioned a lot, and in this, like, they don't really talk about it. In fact, I think after a little bit I was like, oh, this is like a real female-centric kind of movie. Like, it just like, but you don't really think about it because it's more and more about the plot and what's going on, which I did find interesting. A few people mentioned like, this is very like, you never see like this many black female leads in a movie like this, which you don't, but it feels like the Chadwick Boseman part, you don't even really think about it, which is, I guess, more of a like colorblind sort of all lives matter kind of take, but I really do feel like the film gives you that in it. The one thing is like, and I haven't given a plot description, and the main reason is because it's too complicated and too convoluted in a lot of ways. In certain points, like I think the Namor of it all, with Tanakh Herrera as Namor, I've never seen Namor portrayed that way. I've heard people say he was coded Asian or white before, but he was at least Atlantean before this iteration, which was much more Mayan than I've ever seen before. But I really, really liked what they did with that character. I think it worked out really well. I'm not the biggest Namor fan, but as someone who read Namor comics, it felt like a great translation and a great way to take the character. But also, I like that they continued on the thing with Killmonger, where it's a villain who you're like, oh, I mean, he has some points. I think another part of it is Namor is like a interesting character because he's like, I guess, a good guy, but he's also a total motherfucker and a kind of bad, and only cares about, well, he used to care about Atlantis, now he cares about his own underwater kingdom, which now I forget, but in this one. But it's almost like he cares more about that to like a fault, which would make sense to have him deal with the Wakandans, because Wakanda was an isolationist country, much like he's isolationist, and they're kind of trying to either come together or fall apart. What I do like about both the Black Panther films is the idea of both with Namor in this and Killmonger in the previous film is like these people who should be working together are instead tearing each other apart, and it'd be for the better to work together and to figure out a common goal, but instead they're just destroying each other. And what are you really ultimately achieving by destroying each other? Is it more hurtful to destroy each other and not come to sort of an understanding and not have that compromise, not have that diplomacy, while everyone else doesn't need to destroy it? I do think maybe like working on the greater good, and instead of fighting each other over certain things that might be valid points but are not what is going to help us all as society move forward. There was one plot point I will bring up, and a character that they have Ironheart come in this, which I don't think really fully landed. I think for a lot of people did, but I think Namor, and there's so much going on and so many characters, so many plot lines, I can totally understand if you like left one out. I'm like totally afraid I'm going to leave somebody out, but and understandably so. I don't think that landed, but Namor, once the scientist who makes this vibranium detecting machine, it comes out in it that she invented this machine, but she designed it for a class, and the teacher stole the design and sold it to the government, and they're after her. And it's like, I definitely get like you don't want more of these vibranium things, but like we never find out who this teacher was, like who, you know, maybe that's a plot line for the Ironheart show that is coming out on Disney Plus, but I think it's like maybe you should go after that guy, because that guy, I think this guy like is the one who actually made it. Didn't she make the design or something? It just seems like, shouldn't you be figuring out how this chain of command let this happen? And like this kid who like clearly did not intend to do all they did, regardless if they did or not. And same with like the idea of like what's going on with the CIA in this, what's going on with the government. And they bring it up at the beginning when Angela Bassett's character brings up that like if they had this weaponry, if they had the vibranium, what would they do? The evils they'd inflict upon the world. But then instead of kind of dealing with them and dealing with the CIA and all the evil they're doing, they're sort of dealing with this, and it's like they're not really seeing the full big picture and seeing like the evils that they are just sort of letting go in a sense, which I do think was kind of an undercurrent of this. I think that was definitely in the first film, where like they let all this sort of evil happen, like they let like World War II and slavery, and they're like, well, we're in Wakanda, it's cool, we're just gonna ignore that. And you're like, well, morally that's not okay. Like that's like, you kind of have vibranium, you could have like helped out, you know. I feel like there's certain situations like, you know, I'm sort of with you, like I wouldn't want to be involved with Vietnam, but like slavery and World War II, I feel like you should have made an effort. I don't know. And in this, it feels like they have achieved something. They've made Wakandan outposts, things like that, but they're still not used to dealing with people in the outside world, dealing with all these things, and like you still get this kind of sense of naivete, but almost a naivete that shows the political conflicts that we've been having in a very broad sense, which I think still works. I know that's not the kind of political thing people like nowadays, but I think it still says a message, like, you know, these kind of films go out to so many different people, like it's better to fully understand the argument than fight within yourselves. I liked what they did with Black Panther. I do not think they should have recast T'Challa. I think a lot of that is, I think it's a lot to do with like bullshit misogyny things. I look at it this way. I got to be a kid somewhat during Christopher Reeve's being Superman, but I fully remember when he at least broke his back. I mean, I remember when he died, I was older, but when he broke his back, I was like, oh my god, like Superman? That can happen to Superman? Even though I knew it was an actor, but it's just, you felt it anyway. And I think Chadwick Boseman was that kind of a figure for a lot of black kids and for a lot of kids in general. And you can't just redo that right away. And I mean, hell, it took them a while to do a new Superman without Christopher Reeves. And then when they did, he looked like Christopher Reeves. I think like the way they set up for something like that to happen again, not giving anything away here. It's going to be a while, and I think that's the smartest move you can. I was a little surprised they didn't use more M'Baku. I like Winston Duke a lot. I think that was kind of a mistake, if you ask me. I think he should have been used more. I don't think he should have been Black Panther. I think it obviously should have been who it is, which I guess if you don't want to know, click off now, but I think most people see it, which is Shuri. I liked her in the role. I liked Shuri's journey in this. I think it's sort of less of a refusing the call, more of a let's figure out what our lives are going to be like in grief, and oh yeah, okay, I guess we should figure out the Black Panther thing. And it does feel like more people brought up since I've seen it, because I had a really good time when I watched it. I was really into it. Only towards the end did I sort of fall off with it, but I don't know if it's her best performance or anything, but I sort of like her journey in it, having to deal with grief, having to deal with her anger, having to deal with like being more important to Wakanda and stuff. I don't like certain things like what they did with Okoye and just like changing her character in ways with like her Iron Man suit. I'm like, come on, I don't want that. Like, I want to see her with the spear. She's amazing. Like, why are we? I didn't like any of that. That would really bothered me. Other than, the Ironheart stuff, I thought maybe should have either been dealt with better. That did sort of feel like a Marvel Comics thing where, like, you barely sort of understand this character they introduced, and in their own comic, you're like, oh, okay, I get this now. It sort of felt like that's what they were doing, and sort of naturally, but I've heard a lot of people say, I'm excited for a show now, and I'm a little more like, I guess, I don't really, I mean, okay, I don't know, I wasn't as compelled. I thought it was a good performance, stuff like that. But Angela Bassett really absolutely destroys it in this. She's just an amazing actress. She's more amazing than this world deserves, maybe. But she just really brings it in this, and I think she knew she had to, and just amazing. I mean, the fact that like both Black Panther films were at least talking about having Oscar-nominated performances from them, I think says a lot. This was a weird film for Ryan Coogler. I'm a big fan of his as a director, and he had to do something different. I don't think it is as much of a home run or as defining, I think, as those other characters were with him. But I think he sort of navigates it as best you could. There's no like creepy Chadwick Boseman hologram, or like they use weird footage in a weird way. I thought in one of the montages they used a different shot than they did in Black Panther. I might be wrong about that. But that's as much as it goes. It's nothing like, holographic things like in a Sublime video or all those Puffy videos or all the various people that died in the 90s, Nothing like that, thankfully. But his losses all throughout it. I think I saw a bunch of people crying in the theater. At certain points, like the Marvel logo is all him, which I think is like absolutely appropriate. It's a shame. It would have been cool to see him continue as Black Panther. But since he didn't, and since we're in the world we're in, this is the movie we got. And I thought it was a really compelling film. I think when you're in it, you're less critical of it than when you're out of it, which is, I'm curious to see this again and what I'll think of it then. I do think, like, the first Black Panther held up to, I watched that a bunch of times. It's always held up to repeat viewings. I don't know if this one was much, but the Namor parts are so compelling. Everything with Shuri, everything with Wakanda to a certain point. The end blockbustery fight thing feels so much like what Marvel movies do, and there are certain points it almost felt like Coogler let more of the Marvel moviness in, and part of me thinks that might have just been because like they were very nervous about this movie, and I think they let him go in certain regards and let him do his own things, but in other regards it felt like they were like, well, this is an MCU movie, please do what we want so we can sell more Disney Plus shows and subscriptions and stuff, which is sad to see someone who went from, a Best Picture nominated film and overperforming and making so much of the culture had to appeal to that, but it might have just been like, I just want this movie to sort of make some semblance of sense. There was nothing in this that like, this was not a mess. This was a very well held together kind of film for what it was. It holds up way better. I don't think it's perfect, and I think a lot of like, this is the end of Phase 4, I guess, wasn't the most solid one, but I think this is more than a Hail Mary. I'd say it's like a really interesting blockbuster because they had to do so much, and I think they mostly pull it off, but most of it's because of those incredible performances. Lupita Nyong'o being in this, I thought she was great. I actually think a lot of the people in this were, well, I'd say Lupita Nyong'o, Angela Bassett, and Latia Wright were better in this than they were in Black Panther. Particularly Lupita Nyong'o, who I think should be in more stuff. She was really great in this film, as well as Angela Bassett. But Angela Bassett's always good. I don't know, but she was really good in this. But I was thinking about, like, man, I would like to see Lupita Nyong'o in more stuff like this, like big blockbuster stuff or anything really. I think she's a great actress. So it was really held together because it had such a great cast and great people. Like the score was amazing. This guy who made the score was back. Coogler's great at getting DPs and costume designs and stuff. If it didn't have who it had, losing one of the elements wouldn't make it fall apart more than this does. And it's a tricky film. It's not like Fast 7 where, you know, they just had a little footage they had to fix or something. But I do think it worked. It's almost a hard film to talk about because Chadwick Boseman hangs over this film so much. You have so much going on. You have so many things to cover. I do think it'll take a little bit for culturally. I'm curious what people will feel about this film in 2 years, or when, if there's a Black Panther 3 that happens, how will we feel about this? I think it'll take a minute just because there's like so many emotions in this film. It's sort of interesting because as much as you want to say, oh, this is just like blankly Disney labeled content or whatever, it has so much more in there. And I think that's because Ryan Coogler's always been good at cutting through all that and like giving you a distinct emotion. And it felt a little more muddled. It doesn't feel straightforward, and like there wasn't that moment that like hit, and I didn't hear anyone like cheering in the audience like I've seen in Creed and Black Panther. But I did feel like everyone was just like so with the movie, and I was really with the movie while watching it, despite all that going on. It is a very much a minefield for him to go through as a director. I'm very curious what he's going to do after this. Kind of a bigger, denser film in a lot of ways. Maybe it shouldn't have been so much, but I think you basically come out of it still thinking of Chadwick Boseman, thinking of the great performance and everything, but thinking of Namor, who, yeah, it's kind of a quagmire of a movie. I think there's so many elements you could attach yourself to that it's hard not to get compelled and sucked into it. But it's almost also the problem with it is like it has too many of those things. It has too many plot lines, and then it forgets about M'Baku, and you're a little confused like what they were fully doing. And it felt like it was, I've heard it called a bit of a rush job script wise, and you kind of feel that. And it also doesn't do the Marvel thing recently where it feels like more an entry in the MCU than an entry into a franchise. It felt like an entry in a franchise that was part of the MCU, which I actually like. So in terms of navigating the MCU, it felt like Coogler, in terms of like people like Taika Waititi or Sam Raimi, who recently didn't do as good of a job, if we're all being honest here, I think he was able to navigate that well. It's just like getting all that together, and I don't know. At the end, I was happy with it, and I liked it. But everyone who's reviewing it now, you should really look at like this was the context, and I think there's a lot to take in with this. And when we all rewatch it after things have dived down and emotions have cooled and stuff, I'm very curious where this is going to be. But until then, I think it's hard to not be compelled by this film and not feel something by a blockbuster that almost feels like you shouldn't. But I think Coogler still finds a way to. So if you've seen Black Panther Wakanda Forever and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.